Hello and welcome to the next video. This is an important topic, economic growth, and we'll see why. Just a little background here. The year of 1952, that happens to be the way back dinosaur year when I was born. Real GDP was 2.524 trillion. Yes, that's not incorrect. No, that's adjusted for inflation. The U.S. population was roughly 158 million. And so if you take the 2.524 trillion divided by 157.6, 158 million, that's approximately 16,000 per capita GDP. Per capita just means per person. So the real GDP per capita the year I was born, if you were to evenly slice it out to everyone in the United States, it would have been 16,000. Now let's look at the year 2024, the year that I'm recording this, and actually the data for the second quarter. I'm recording this in May. The data for the second quarter has not been released yet because we're not there yet, and so the only GDP calculations or data we have for the first quarter, and then this is annualized. So this is if it continued on, production continued on the same pattern. So if that happens, it looks like we will produce not quite 23 trillion, 22.679 trillion. And the U.S. population currently is a little over 328 million. So if you take the 22.679 trillion divided by the 328.2 million, that's 67,000, and that's in real terms. So notice that the year I was born, each person, if it's evenly divided, would had 16,000, and that's in real terms. That's adjusted for inflation. Nowadays it's 67. Yes, we are much, much wealthier than way back in 1952. So it has increased over 270, or about, that is, 274%. That's what we just have come to expect, but we're really spoiled in thinking that this economic growth is something that goes on forever. From way back, let's say 1000 BC to the early 1700s, world economic growth was basically, there wasn't any. It was pretty well flat. So if you lived in, say, zero, right, I guess there wasn't a zero, but in year one, AD, and then if you lived in 1699, the world's wealth, the world's income, the world's standard of living was about the same. Now, obviously, it varied widely among countries and certainly among individuals. But overall, from what we can figure out, obviously, there wasn't wonderful data back then, but from what can be figured out, that's true. Now, we want economic growth. Here are some of the reasons. That's the only way that, in general, everyone can have a higher standard of living in terms of real wages. If not, then it's going to be a situation where one's taken from the other. There can be a redistribution of income where some have higher real wages, but then that's at the expense of others if we don't have economic growth. Economic growth is just a sustained increase in real GDP. We're going to have a higher standard of living for future generations if we have economic growth. And you can think about an economy in terms of GDP as being a pie, like let's say a pizza pie. And so if you're having more people eating that pizza, each piece, if you divide it evenly, each piece is smaller. So if we have population growth, you better have economic growth. Real GDP must be increasing, or the slices of that pie get smaller. Now, are there some downsides? Certainly, there are several downsides. Here are three, though. There's the production is not necessarily clean, so it could add to environmental issues. And this is kind of just my personal feel, but especially around big city areas that are growing rapidly, I just don't like them, to be honest with you, because it's just such a maddening crowd. So crowded, traffic, roads seem to never be up to par because they're always having to increase the lanes and work on them and all that good stuff. And then economic growth doesn't allow for us to keep our culture and traditions as easily. Things change. So there's certainly some downsides. Now, the real key to economic growth by far is an increase in labor productivity. Labor productivity is basically how much output per worker per hour is produced. And if on average that increases, then we have economic growth. If it doesn't, we don't. And the economic growth in terms of GDP changes would be this anything above this flat line that's at zero. Now, we're not sure about productivity and how we measure it in this new internet age with AI and all that good stuff. So the productivity measures may be a little off. We're not really clear on that, to be quite honest with you. But I want to talk about just graphically different ways to illustrate economic growth. The good old production possibility frontier or production possibility curve. If you have a rightward shift in the whole curve, that would represent economic growth. Doesn't have to be a parallel shift like this is, but it's economic growth. Now, something that I want to make sure, this is kind of nitpicky terminology, but if we're in a recession, like at point A, any point inside a given curve, let's start with this inner one first, then that represents underproduction. If that's occurred for a while, we're in a recession. Any return back to just normal production and a full employment, that would just be going back to the original curve. That's not economic growth. That's just recovery from a recession. Economic growth is where we're able to produce more than what we were before in general. Another way is we can think about the business cycle and economic growth. Again, it's not the fact that we're recovering from a recession. That would be from this trough up to here. It's the fact that over time, with a cycle, that if you average out that cycle, the ups and the downs, that line has a positive slope, and the value of that positive slope would measure economic growth. Well, what are the sources of increased productivity in general, or economic growth in general, and productivity for the most part? Well, certainly if new resources are discovered, some new resource that allows us to produce twice as much of something as before, maybe at a reduced environmental cost, like well, I won't go there. You can guess what you want to on that. New resources certainly add to economic growth. Investment in physical capital, that's new machines, new technology, but also investment in human capital. And I've mentioned the technology down here too. Investment in human capital is where the average worker has a greater ability to be productive. In other words, their productivity increases. Well, if it's increasing not because of an increase in physical capital, in other words, not because of the machines or the software that they use, just but because they are learning how to better do something, in other words, education and training, that's investment in human capital. And that's certainly very, very important. Now, it turns out that if we have a positive annual rate of growth, even if the percentage change is pretty small, over time, it can be tremendous. It can be tremendous. And to help you understand that, I want to talk about something called the rule of 72s. A lot of books now are using the rule of 70s because it's just easier to do the calculations. But mathematically, it's actually more accurate to use the number 72. It has to do with continuous compounding of the natural number, but we won't go there. So this is a formula. So you take 72, that's a fixed number, it's not variable, divided by whatever the annual rate of interest is, the growth rate, we'll call it, and then that'll give you the number of years necessary to double whatever we're talking about. So let's talk about GDP. So if the GDP growth rate per year on average is 2%, 72 divided by 2 would say that it would take roughly about 36 years, but that's doubling GDP. So, for example, right now, it's talking about going from about 23 trillion to 46 trillion, and that's in real terms. That's very significant. Yeah, 36 years is a long time, but it's really less than a lifetime if you think about it. Well, what's true if we go down to say like 10 years, though? Excuse me, I didn't say it the way I wanted to. Let's say we go 10% of growth rate, which some countries achieve that for a short time, not very long. Well, it would only take 7.2 years. And where I was headed and got ahead of myself is you can also take 72 divided by the number of years you want something to double, and that'll give you the interest rate, or excuse me, the compound growth rate necessary to achieve that doubling. So, for example, if you want something to double in 10 years, 72 divided by 10, that would take about 7.2 years for that thing to double. So this is a very useful rule of thumb. It's not exactly totally precise, but it's a good estimation. So I hope that you understand that economic growth is important. Yes, there are some negatives, but generally, I think the positives outweigh the negatives.